Welcome back, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. I tied off the top of my duffel bag, checked the weight, then shoved it into the corner near the door. It wasn't loaded heavy, just essentials. Pry bar wrapped in rubber grip, bolt cutters, 2 wedges, small light stick with red filter, gaffer tape, a piece of dried meat, and a nearly flat roll of chalk. Water flask was half full. I'd fill the rest once we cleared the trench line. Eleanor knocked twice before I opened the door. She stepped in fast, shoulders hunched against the cold, jacket zipped too high up her chin. I nodded to her and she slid her gloves off and started adjusting her pack straps. Her eyes didn't stop moving. Good. She was nervous, not panicked. Marcus was already sitting near the corner by the burn barrel, eating something dry out of his hand. I didn't ask what it was. Probably jerky or toasted beans. Priya stood beside him, focused on wrapping tape over the side button of her radio. She'd remembered. I didn't have to say anything. I shook one of the red chem sticks, then cracked it near the base and snapped on the filter cap. It gave off a low, dull glow, enough to light the room without lighting us up. I set it in the middle of the floor and looked around at the 3 of them. "We move in 2 minutes," I said. "No talking once we step out. Elena behind me, Priya behind her. Marcus holds rear." Nobody argued. Marcus finished chewing and slung his rifle over his shoulder. It was taped and chambered empty. He carried it like it was part of him, not something he wanted to use. Priya nodded once and secured the headlamp back into her coat pocket. Eleanor checked the small bubble level she clipped to her side pouch. I never asked where she got it, but she swore by it ever since a storm door nearly took her head off last month. At exactly 1:33 in the morning, I stepped outside into the alley behind the warehouse. The air was cold and flat. No scent of fresh rot, no grease fire, just brick dust, dry trash, and a little copper tang in the breeze. Wind was coming in from the west and pushing east. That meant scent and sound would carry toward the river. I didn't like it, but it would have to do. We moved down Moya in a tight file, 1 pace between each of us. My boots touched down light and steady. Eleanor matched my stride. I didn't have to check behind me to know the others were keeping pace. The only noise came from loose wrappers fluttering near a blown-out window overhead. No moaning, no feet dragging. The street was clear, at least for now. We turned onto Frankfurt and crossed under the old market sign, sticking to the shadow line just beneath the broken streetlights. A rusted cart lay in the middle of the road with part of a child's seat still strapped to it. I skirted wide around it. Eleanor stepped over it. Marcus made a tight arc behind her, but bumped his backpack into a box of glass. 1 small bottle rolled out, clinking once. Everyone froze. I crouched low and waited. We stood like that for maybe 20 seconds. There was no movement, no response. The city stayed silent. We moved again. By the time we reached Spring Garden, the wind picked up just enough to cut down the smell of rust. I stopped behind a half-collapsed sedan and raised my hand. Everyone paused. Across the intersection, I scanned for any silhouettes near the upper windows or rooftops. Everything above was dark. Nobody watching. I waved the others forward one at a time, and we crossed fast, sticking low. We hit the back alleys leading toward the convention district and followed the same path I used 6 months ago. Back then, the whole south section of the convention center had collapsed inward, and one of the truck bays blew out from underneath. That opening still looked untouched. No new barricades, no signs of hostile scavengers, still enough space to crawl through the right side. I dropped to 1 knee and slipped through first. Inside smelled like mildew, burnt carpeting, and rat waste. I scanned the wide loading dock. 1 janitor cart had fallen onto its side. Empty racks lined the walls. It was too quiet. No bird sound, no rat scratching, just that slow drip coming from a cracked ceiling joint. I turned back and motioned Elena forward. She crawled through carefully, but her pack caught on the lower edge and scraped against the steel lip. I winced. She froze for a few seconds, then pushed forward and came in clean. Priya followed next. She didn't make a sound, Marcus was last. He grunted once, then hit the ground a little harder than he should have. We all held our breath. There was a slight creak from above. I raised my light. Just a rat tail hanging off a vent. Nothing else. We kept moving. The interior halls were stripped bare. Sheetrock cracked open. Ceiling tiles curled down like wet paper. Metal rails twisted from fire or collapse. We walked down the main corridor in single file, keeping to the left side where the old food court used to be. Marcus tapped my arm once and pointed to a shattered soda machine that had collapsed inward. Something had dragged it from the back. Teeth marks across the glass edge. Not small ones. I didn't say anything, just motioned him to move. We cut through a collapsed service hallway and reached the stairwell near the convention theater entrance. I tapped the handrail 3 times before heading down. The sound didn't bounce. That was good. The red chem stick gave just enough glow to see the next step. We moved down 2 flights. No issues. At the bottom, we pushed into the lower corridor that led toward Reading Terminal. This stretch had always felt wrong. The walls were narrow, maybe 6 feet across, and the overhead lights were dead. We passed between walls smeared with black smoke and marker graffiti. Eleanor kept close, her hand near the bubble level on her side. She stopped once, crouched down, and pointed to a fresh-looking boot scuff across the linoleum. I crouched to look. Rubber, deep tread, adult size. Could be no more than a few days old. We moved slower from then on. We exited into the rear of the market storage level. Water had leaked through the ceiling and pooled into dark patches that smelled like bleach and rot. There were at least 4 carts collapsed across each other by the old prep tables. One still had dry goods wrappers inside. No blood, no drag marks. Looked like someone raided it for packaging but left the contents. We reached the southeast exit and peered out toward 11th. It was wide open and clear. The cold air outside was dry and still. Eleanor adjusted her scarf and kept her face low. We passed a wrecked food truck. The entire back door ripped off and burned black. I didn't look inside. We reached Jefferson's lower ramp just after 2:15. The delivery van was still there, blocking the wide path, but we could slip past the passenger side without trouble. I went first and reached the rear stairwell. The steel door was closed, but I could see the rust around the hinges. Not locked. Priya stepped up behind me and tested it gently. She stopped, looked at me, and whispered low, "It pulls." I nodded. She opened it just enough for us to slip through, and we entered the stairwell. The air hit me in the face, dry, cold, and smelling faintly of disinfectant, mold, and rust. We descended fast and quiet, 3 levels down. Eleanor wedged the bubble level into the hinge line at the base to keep the door from closing completely. Smart. The sub-basement felt like a cave. Thick walls, no windows, and the hum of something deep in the structure that still echoed through the floor. Not power, just the building breathing. The pharmacy cage was ahead, lock already broken from a previous run. Chain link fencing peeled open at the bottom. I slid in first and checked the shelves with the filtered light. Blister packs still sealed, medical tape intact. No signs of tampering, nothing fresh. Priya got to work without a word. She moved with precision, scanning each label and dropping only what she needed into the dry bag. She tossed aside expired insulin, grabbed oral antibiotics, gauze, alcohol prep pads. She stopped once, held up 2 boxes of saline flushes, then put one back. Too much weight. Smart. Priya moved with speed, but there was a kind of focus to her hands. The way she pinched blister packs one by one and felt them before tossing them into the dry bag. Every 5 seconds, she double-checked the label, tapped it against her palm, and made a quick decision. She ignored the heavy boxes of wrapped bandages stacked on the bottom shelves. They were sealed, sure, but bulky. Same with the IV kits near the side rack. Too much fluid weight for what we needed. She moved on to wound care trays, single-dose pill sleeves, compact suture kits. No hesitation. She'd done this before, maybe too many times now. Behind her, Eleanor watched the hallway entrance through the chain link gap we'd peeled back. She had her gloves tucked under her arm and one hand on the hilt of her baton, not drawn, just ready. Her eyes didn't blink much. She wasn't nervous anymore, more like locked in. I stood beside the door frame, angled to keep my back partially against the cement pillar, left shoulder low in case I had to pivot fast. I hadn't heard anything new, but something about the weight of the air didn't feel right. The kind of tension that crawls in slow without sound, without light, just wait. Priya held up a pair of nasal swab kits, looked at me once, then dropped both into her pouch. Then she went still. Her head turned a little, like she caught a breath of something different in the air. She sniffed once, then held her breath. I did the same. There was a faint smell of wet cardboard, the kind of moldy rot that builds up near damp drywall, but this was sharper, more like leather that had sat too long in a puddle. I crouched slowly, resting my elbow on my knee, and leaned my head just enough to peer around the edge of the hallway through the broken wire mesh. The corridor ahead was pitch black, not a sliver of movement, but there had been a noise just a second ago. Low, deliberate, not the scratch of rodents or the slow air movement of dead fans. Somewhere beyond the open maintenance access at the far end of the corridor, a boot slid against concrete. Just once, not dragging, stepping. I tapped the bolt cutter handle twice to signal Elena. She crouched down fully, pressed her back to the shelving behind her, and tilted her head toward the sound. She heard it too. Marcus stepped in from the other side of the pharmacy cage, breathing shallow through his nose. He leaned into the wire and mouthed the words, "Human or not?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. Priya finished the last handful of meds. She zipped the dry bag, clipped the second strap to her shoulder, and slowly eased out of the cage. We stayed low. We didn't talk. I motioned toward the stairwell door. She nodded. Eleanor was already at the door, removing the wedge. She slid it free and held the level to my chest without looking. I took it, clipped it back to her side, and pushed the door open just enough to peek. The stairwell was empty, just as we'd left it. No smell of rot, no echoes. I listened hard. The building didn't creak. No one was moving. I signaled her to go first. She stepped out and hugged the wall. Priya followed next, then Marcus. I was last. The door shut gently behind me, but we didn't wedge it again. No time. We were already moving up the steps when the breath came again from the hallway behind us. Louder this time, sharp and dry, almost a cough but muffled. We climbed faster, boots landing light. I skipped the fourth step on each flight, remembered from last time that it had a hollow bounce. Marcus kept up without dragging. Eleanor moved quick and silent. At the top landing, she paused at the corner and flattened herself against the wall, holding her baton low. I leaned beside her and peered down the hallway. Our entry point still looked untouched. The door we'd come through was slightly ajar. Nobody visible, but there was new chalk on the wall just beside the electrical panel, a vertical slash intersected by a short horizontal mark. That wasn't there earlier. Someone marked us. Someone who knew what the symbols meant. Whoever it was had watched us long enough to know we'd entered, and they waited until we were inside to leave a message. That wasn't a threat, it was a warning. We weren't alone in Jefferson, and someone else didn't want company. I motioned to skip the original route and cut through the maintenance access tunnel instead. It would take us around the rear of the records hall and into the back stairs of the adjacent parking garage. That added an extra 5 minutes, but I wasn't walking into an ambush. We moved tight, flashlights still off. The only light came from the small filtered beam clipped under Priya's collar. She ducked into the service tunnel and we followed. The smell of dust and lubricant grew stronger. Walls were close. Pipes lined both sides, some still wet from old pressure leaks. Eleanor reached up and tapped a series of hanging wires out of her face. Something squeaked above us. She froze, eyes locked on the ceiling. Just a rat this time, thin and grey, running across a conduit like it owned the place. We made it to the rear stairwell without incident. The steel door opened clean with a little force, and we stepped into the garage's third sublevel. The interior was quiet, bone dry, and coated in fine black dust. Burnt tire marks curved near the corners. At some point, someone tried to light a barricade and failed. The smell of plastic still lingered. We stayed on the outer lane, following the faded arrows that curved toward the exit ramps. I checked every parked car for movement, even the ones covered in soot. Nothing shifted. One had its rear window broken from the inside. Blood on the passenger door, brown and dried. Nothing fresh. We kept walking. At the top of the ramp, we paused behind an old utility van and scanned the surface level. This was where it always felt like things could fall apart. From here, it was 4 blocks back to the convention center, and nothing in between but open ground, narrow alleys, and collapsed storefronts. I reached into my pack and handed Marcus a plastic bottle half filled with water. He took a slow sip and passed it to Priya, who barely drank. We all knew better than to push our bodies hard now. We needed that energy later. We dropped back into the alley line that ran behind Ludlow and came up beside 12th Street. Trash bins lay overturned against the wall, burned and empty. The pavement was covered in broken tiles, scrap wire, and bits of office paper soaked from past rain. One of the torn sheets had hospital forms on it, something about staff redeployment and treatment logs. I stepped over it and kept moving. Halfway down the block, we heard it again. A soft scrape, rubber on concrete, this time close. This time not from the building behind us. We stopped cold. Marcus crouched beside a delivery bike frame and scanned the corner. Eleanor turned her head slowly toward the sound. It wasn't steady, just a step, then another, then silence, like someone following without the breath control to do it quietly. I moved to the rear and pulled the small mirror from my back pouch, tilted it against the angle of the broken newsstand beside us, and waited. On the far end of the sidewalk, half hidden behind the edge of a burned bus shelter, someone stood very still. Human shape, average height, wrapped in a heavy coat, backpack low on their spine, hands tucked into their sleeves, just standing, not moving, not twitching, no weapon in view, but they were watching. I held up 2 fingers to Marcus, pointed behind us, then tapped my wrist. He understood. We changed direction and ducked into the alley across from the market. That would send us 2 blocks west, off the original exfil route, longer way home, but safer. We moved fast, not loud. 4 blocks through Chinatown alleys, past the shell of a boarded liquor store and under the collapsed balcony of a noodle bar. Eleanor nearly tripped on an exposed pipe, but Priya grabbed her arm before she went down. No sound beyond our own breath. When we reached the far side of Vine Street, the city opened up again. Just shadows, dead streetlights, and the faint screech of wind coming off the I-95 corridor. We stopped behind an overturned bus shelter and took a moment. Everyone checked their packs. Priya scanned the meds, still sealed, nothing broken. I counted the light sticks left, 2 unopened, 1 active, no battery burn yet. Then we heard the infected. It started low, 1 groan, somewhere north of us, then a second. Then the echo of movement, slow, deliberate, dragged steps against gravel and glass. We didn't know how many, didn't wait to find out. I pointed east. We moved fast, looping behind the burnt daycare center and past the old print shop with the smashed red awning. The infected weren't runners, not yet, but if they got close enough to spot you, they didn't stop tracking. We crossed under the old red pedestrian bridge and dropped into the back line behind Spring Garden. The wind was stronger here. It hit our scent and pushed it east, right toward the direction we came from. That meant any infected behind us might follow the trail longer than usual. I stopped beside a twisted bike rack and pulled the emergency flare from my coat. I crouched and sparked it against the pavement. Once it lit, I threw it sideways across the street toward a collapsed staircase. The flare landed near the edge and burned hot and bright, casting red light across the broken building face. The flare hissed against the pavement as it burned, throwing hard shadows against the base of the building across from us. Its glow spilled into the street like a beacon, not just of light but of sound. The old metal gutter above it began to creak as the heat rose. A few flakes of soot fell, But it held. I didn't wait to see how long it would last. I turned and motioned the others forward, and we cut left through the next alley, skirting a rusted scaffolding frame and climbing over a low railing that had once separated a restaurant patio from the sidewalk. Everything was glass back there. Broken windows, display cases, cabinet doors. I didn't like the crunch underfoot, but moving slow wasn't an option anymore. Once that flare drew attention, this block would light up. We dropped down a side stairwell into what used to be a service hallway for a row of apartments. The concrete walls were moldy and discolored. 2 of the overhead lights had collapsed, the fixtures dangling down on bare wire like old bones. We stayed low and moved fast. I could still hear movement behind us, uneven steps and the dry shuffle of the infected, too far to count, but close enough that I didn't need to. At the other end of the hallway, we came up against a steel service door. The push bar was still intact, but the lock was jammed with something hard. Marcus stepped up, slid a wedge into the lower crack, and braced against the frame. I didn't need to tell him anything. He gave one solid shove, and the door creaked open. Eleanor moved through first, followed by Priya and Marcus. I held the door long enough to pull the wedge, then let it shut behind me. It didn't close all the way, but it was enough. Outside again, we were just 2 blocks from base. The last stretch took us behind an old car wash that had been gutted out during the second wave. I remembered seeing 3 different scavenger crews fight over fuel back here in the early days. None of them made it out. The burn marks were still visible on the pavement. Black smears, grease-stained concrete, bullet holes in the cinder block walls. I moved ahead of the group and slowed at the corner near the old mural. Some city-funded art piece that hadn't aged well. Someone had tagged over it with a warning, "Trap zone, keep right." I'd seen that same tag on the north side of the trench back in July. It usually meant someone had rigged up motion or sound traps for the infected. Could be tripwires, cans on string, or worse, lure rigs using animal scent. We cut right and stayed against the wall. I pointed up to the camera pole near the intersection. The lens was cracked but still aimed at the street. No power, but you never assume. Some crews ran closed-circuit battery rigs just to catch looters. The worst weren't the ones looking to steal. The worst were the ones trying to trap people alive. The longer you stayed in the city, the more you learned which markings to trust and which ones meant someone was watching. We crossed the narrow bridge that spanned a drainage culvert behind the warehouse district. The wind was picking up again, colder now. My coat wasn't enough to block it. I could feel sweat cooling under my pack straps. The taste of metal crept back into my mouth. Eleanor wiped her face with the inside of her sleeve, then adjusted her grip on the baton. Priya didn't speak. Her eyes were locked forward, jaw tight, shoulders stiff. We reached the final stretch, a fenced-in alley running parallel to the rail line that split off into our side of the neighborhood. This part of the city still had some stability, not safety, but predictability. There were no civilian enclaves here, no large groups trying to hold a perimeter, just 2-story brick shells, scavenger nests, and our crew behind reinforced metal walls 5 blocks deep. We passed the signal point, the red-painted cinder block with the drilled hole in the center. Elena knelt beside it and tapped twice with the pry bar, then paused. No reply. Good. No warning signs. No evac signals. That meant no new activity since we left. I tapped her shoulder and we moved on. The warehouse came into view as we rounded the corner behind a fenced lot full of crushed shipping crates and stacked pallets. The exterior was the same. Plain brick, metal door, locked hatch, no lights. The antenna mast was still upright. No damage. No sign of breach. I tapped out the code on the side panel. 7 knocks, pause, then 3, and the door opened from inside. Devon stood in the entryway holding the handle of a battered crowbar. He looked us over, eyes quick but tired, then stepped aside. "Everyone in," he said, quietly. We slipped inside one at a time. Once the door shut, I pulled off my gloves and unbuckled the top strap on my bag. Priya passed the dry bag straight to Devon, who handed it off to Lena, one of the older med volunteers. She carried it toward the back room without a word. Inside, the warehouse hadn't changed. Same layout. Center fire barrel, work tables covered in tools, dry racks with salvaged gear stacked in crates. A few people stirred from their cots along the back wall, but no one asked questions. Everyone in that room had done their share of runs, and nobody celebrated until inventory was done. I peeled off my coat and dropped onto one of the benches. The air inside was warmer than outside, but not by much. It took a minute before the sweat stopped itching under my arms. Marcus sat down across from me, untied one boot, and winced as he rubbed the edge of his heel. No blood, but the sock was worn through on the back. Priya was already checking the outer seal on the med bag to make sure the boxes hadn't shifted too hard in the last stretch. Elena sat beside me and leaned her head back against the cold wall. She didn't speak, didn't move, just breathed. Nobody said it aloud, but we all knew something had shifted on that run. Not just the new markings at Jefferson or the shadow we spotted watching us near the shelter. It was the feeling that the city wasn't just decaying anymore. It was adapting. Whoever else was still out there wasn't wandering blind. They were watching, measuring, timing. 30 minutes later, Lena returned from the back and gave me a nod. "It's clean," she said. "Antibiotics are all in date. Gauze packs too. That'll hold the line on the sick room for at least a couple weeks." I nodded and stood. "Tell Mason he owes me his other boot," I said. She smiled, thin and tired, then walked off. I didn't follow. I walked back outside and climbed the fire escape to the upper platform. From there, I could see the rooftops stretching out toward the east, past the trench and all the way to the highway line, where the buildings thinned out and the sky opened. It was still dark. Just past 3 in the morning. The city hadn't stirred yet. But it would. I pulled the bolt cutters from my belt, laid them on the railing, and leaned forward, elbows resting on the cold metal. Somewhere out there, someone marked the building we entered. Someone with access, symbols, timing. Someone who didn't care that we saw the warning on the way out. That meant confidence. Or worse, indifference. I stayed on the platform longer than I should have. The cold was setting into my shoulders, stiffening the joints. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the kind of weight you feel after you cross a line and know you'll have to do it again. Below me, the rest of the crew had gone quiet. A few low voices inside. Metal scraping against a pot. Nothing more. No one asking questions about what we saw near Jefferson. No one pressing for detail. That kind of silence didn't come from peace. It came from understanding the cost of knowledge. If you couldn't do anything about it, maybe it was better not to know. I picked up the bolt cutters, slung them back into the clip at my side, and climbed back down. My knees were aching from the cold and the weight. By the time my boots hit the ground, the first glow of dawn was starting to lift behind the rooftops. It wasn't much, just a faded grey seam along the skyline. I stepped inside and saw Marcus laying out a series of scribbled notes on the table. Old street maps, waypoints, chalk sketches. He was trying to log the new marks we'd seen. "They updated the Jefferson entry," I said, not needing to read his notes to confirm. "Clean vertical with a side notch. Someone's still using that space." He nodded and marked it down. "Same system as last time?" "More precise this time. Whoever's doing it isn't just tagging buildings. They're tracking movement patterns. Could be mapping which doors get opened. Might be tracking crews like ours." He didn't respond to that, and I didn't expect him to. We were all thinking it. We hadn't seen another survivor face to face in weeks, but that didn't mean they weren't around. The difference now was someone wasn't hiding. Someone was choosing to be seen. Priya was in the back sorting the meds into the low-temp drawer that still had passive insulation left from the old rigged cooler system. The power cell we'd built 2 months ago still held charge from the solar rig on the roof, but with fall here and the sun getting weaker, it wouldn't last much longer. We had maybe 6 weeks of reliable refrigeration at most, less if we had another stretch of overcast skies. Elena sat alone near the east-facing window, chewing on dried lentils from a sealed pouch. Her baton lay across her knees, and her boots were still half-laced. She'd taken off her gloves but hadn't moved since I came in. I watched her for a second, then walked over. "You get any sleep?" I asked. She shook her head, chewing slowly, eyes still on the window. "I keep thinking about that flare," she said after a while. "I keep wondering if it was enough, if we threw it too early, or if we gave away our trail." "It wasn't perfect," I answered, "but it bought us time. That's all it ever does." We sat there in silence for a few minutes before she stood and walked toward the back with the others. I stayed by the window, watching the skyline shift from grey to pale blue. The city didn't look different, but it felt different. Not louder, not more dangerous, just more alive, and not in the good way. Like someone had turned a page on the calendar and decided it was time to stop scavenging and start organizing. Around 8, Devin called for a group check-in. We gathered around the center table. No one brought chairs. Everyone stood. "Priority meds are secured," he said, nodding to Priya. "No losses. Inventory's clean. Mason's fever broke this morning. Lena says we've got enough to hold him stable for the week." That was good news. Mason had been out of rotation for over 10 days with a leg wound from a broken pipe joint. If he bounced back, we'd have another runner in the rotation. "Next order of business, radio intercepts," Devin continued. Bert picked up a shortwave pulse just after 3. 2 tones, equal pitch spacing, 15 seconds apart. No voice. Repeated twice, then cut off. Origin was northeast, probably uplinked from somewhere near the train yard. I didn't like that. The train yard was a graveyard last time we scouted it. Dozens of rusted out cars, some stacked, others half derailed. Bad acoustics, blind turns, and more dark space than you could cover in a week. But it was the only place in that direction that still had the elevation for a proper antenna rig. "Encrypted?" I asked. "Could be," he said. "Could also be a marker beacon, automated, battery-timed or solar ping." "Anybody else hear it?" He shook his head. "No rebroadcasts, just the 2 pulses. Directional, short band." Elena stepped closer, still holding her food pouch. "Could it be linked to the person we saw?" I nodded slowly. "Or part of their system. If they're moving across mapped routes and leaving codes, they may have drop points, relay triggers, signal bounces." Marcus leaned forward. "So they're building a network?" "Maybe," I said. "Or they're maintaining one." The room stayed quiet for a while after that. We all understood what it meant. If there were other survivors actively coordinating movement, sharing signals, tagging locations, then this was no longer just a matter of avoiding the infected. This was now about territory. Devin ended the meeting without assigning new tasks. Everyone went back to their corners, some to clean gear, others to rest or eat. I stayed at the table and laid out the route log from the Jefferson run. I marked the new chalk symbols, the place where we saw the observer, and the point where we dropped the flare. Every one of those spots would need to be revisited soon, not just for scavenging, but for recon. By mid-morning, the warehouse quieted. Some of the crew finally slept. Others rotated onto watch. I didn't rest. I unpacked my loadout, cleaned the tools, and repacked them. The bolt cutters went back into their sleeve. The pry bar got rewrapped with new grip tape. I refilled my soft flask, checked my light stick reserves, and tested the radio for static drift. Everything was still operational. Around noon, a runner from the North Line returned with a half-full cart of salvaged insulation, electrical wire, and 2 sealed battery cores. They'd found them in a post office garage on Lehigh Avenue. I helped them unload, then checked the cart wheels. One of them had cracked under stress. We'd have to replace it before the next haul. After that, I finally sat down for a proper meal. Rice, canned carrots, and a chunk of smoked squirrel that one of the scouts had brought in from the rooftop traps. Not much, but enough to keep me steady. By evening, the temperature dropped fast. The wind pushed in hard from the west, snapping the loose plastic sheeting we had covering one of the blown-out window frames. Marcus and I secured it with screws and washers, reinforced it with an old tabletop wedged against the wall. It wouldn't stop a direct breach, but it would hold against the cold and the wind. By the time we got the sheeting reinforced and the last screw torqued into the frame, the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. My hands were starting to stiffen from the cold, but I didn't bother warming them up. There was no point. The metal still felt like ice no matter how many layers we wore. We'd burned through the last of the foam insulation during the second cold front 3 weeks ago. All we had left now were folded tarps and the odd scrap of old carpet pulled from abandoned row houses. It did enough to make a difference, but not enough to make the place comfortable. Marcus brushed dust off his coat and checked the bolt locks on the rear door. The hinge creaked again. I made a note to grease it in the morning. Noise like that gets ignored in normal weather, but wind has a way of carrying metal-on-metal sound straight through alley corridors and across streets. I didn't want to take chances. Not when the city was shifting. Not after what we'd seen. Inside, Lena had set up the folding divider around the small med area and was organizing supplies with a checklist scratched onto a salvaged clipboard. She'd brought in Mason's cot from the back and propped his leg up using a thick coil of towels. The antibiotics we'd recovered were already working. His fever had dropped below the danger mark, and the smell of infection had faded. His skin still looked bad, but the wound was no longer leaking. That was enough to give him a shot at recovery. I stood by the metal column near the center of the room and went over the day's log. Inventory was stable. No losses during the supply run. No follow-up sightings since the flare. But there were things we couldn't account for. That observer near the bus shelter, the fresh chalk mark near Jefferson, the dual pulse signal that had come over the radio just after 3 in the morning. Too many unknowns, and not enough patterns. Around 9, Devin asked me to walk perimeter with him. We made the rounds outside the warehouse, checking the fence lines, pressure plates, and trip lines we'd set up along the north alley. The plates were homemade, scrap wood panels laid over pressure switches pulled from disabled fire alarms. They weren't perfect, but they triggered low-light indicators inside if someone crossed them. We didn't rely on them for defense. They were just advance notice. In this city, warning was more valuable than armor. We checked each panel in silence. Devin didn't say much until we reached the far wall near the half-buried utility box that ran under the building. He squatted down, pointed to the frozen mud around the base of the casing, and scratched at it with a gloved finger. "Noticed this earlier," he said. "Looks like someone walked the perimeter this morning." I crouched beside him. The tracks weren't deep, but they had shape. Not boots from our group. The tread was narrower, more uniform. Probably sneakers or running shoes. Light step, short stride. "Could have been last night," I said, brushing snow away from one edge. "Or early this morning before the sun hit. Whoever it was didn't linger." Devin stood up and adjusted the strap on his chest rig. "You think it's the same person we saw?" "I think we weren't careful enough covering our trail, and if someone watched us long enough to follow us back, it means they know the route." We reset the trip line, added a secondary can rig with fishing wire looped to the chain link. It wouldn't stop anybody, but it'd slow them or spook them enough to make noise. After that, we finished the loop around the building and went back inside. The air inside was warmer than before, thanks to a second barrel fire that had been set up near the southwest wall. I didn't ask who lit it. I was just glad someone had. Later that night, we finally sat down to do what we'd been avoiding since the run. Break down the full route and figure out what we missed. We spread out the old paper maps on the long table near the center rack and started marking each move from the previous night. Eleanor pointed out the spot where we'd seen the observer. Priya traced the path where the flare had been tossed. Marcus redrew the perimeter around Jefferson and the alley with the new chalk symbol. Then we got to the quiet part, the spot we didn't mark during the run. The gap between the rear hallway of the market and the loading dock corridor, a stretch of maybe 30 feet, where we passed by a service stairwell without clearing it. I remembered it, clearly now. We moved past fast, too focused on the exit path. No one checked the door. No one scanned the landing. That was the mistake. That was the blind spot. If someone was watching us, they didn't need to be outside. They just needed to be above or behind that stairwell. From there, They could have seen our movement, our direction, the time we spent gathering supplies. If they had a radio or a signaling mirror, they could have tagged our position for someone else. We circled that section on the map 3 times. Red ink, top priority for a follow-up check. Not for a full run, not yet, just a recon pass. Maybe send 2 people with light kits, no heavy gear, move fast, observe, fall back, no engagement, just eyes and confirmation. Devon agreed to the recon, but not for another 24 hours. We needed to rest, check our gear, and let the rotation breathe. After a run like Jefferson, we didn't double up unless it was life or death. We could afford to wait one day. At least that's what we told ourselves. We waited out the full 24. No one touched the maps until the sun was up and the perimeter report came back clean. No fresh tracks. No signs of infected drifting through. The wind had shifted slightly to the southeast during the night, carrying the scent of rot toward the train corridor. That gave us a short window, long enough for a recon run if we didn't stall. I didn't pick Marcus or Elena for this one. They needed rest. Instead, I took Cal and Ortega, 2 of the newer runners who'd only done short trips through the West Vine shelters and a few dry runs in the old market zone. Neither of them had been near Jefferson before. I didn't like that, but I needed eyes I could afford to lose. That was the kind of math you had to do now. Not everyone was built for recon, and not everyone got the second chance to learn from mistakes. We stepped out just after 8. Daylight was thin but present. The streets were empty, the frost still clinging to the north-facing corners of the pavement. I led us east through the alley lines behind Girard, keeping out of sight of any elevated positions. The wind was low enough that our footfalls felt louder than usual, but I didn't slow our pace. We weren't running supplies. We weren't here to dig through wreckage. This was eyes only, in and out, no contact. Cal kept asking about the flare we'd dropped. He was fixated on the way it burned, whether it could be seen from multiple angles, whether the red color infected the same way white light did. I told him to stop talking. Ortega stayed quiet. He kept one hand on his jacket zipper like it was some kind of panic switch. I'd seen that twitch before. Usually meant the nerves were starting to take over. We cut across 11th, past the burnt-out laundromat, then climbed over the collapsed dumpster that blocked the old loading corridor near Jefferson. The same marker was still on the wall, fresh, untouched, vertical slash, side notch, faint crosshatch above. That last part hadn't been there before. It was small, just 3 lines carved into the upper brick with something metal, a code we didn't know. We moved fast across the back ramp and slipped into the same stairwell as before. I had Cal wedge the door with a piece of rubber from the handle of his crowbar. Not ideal, but it worked. The air inside was colder than I remembered, probably from exposure to outside vents we hadn't seen last time. The hallway lights were still dead. The smell of bleach and rust hadn't changed. We didn't go into the pharmacy cage. That wasn't the objective. We made our way straight toward the service stairwell we'd missed on the last run. The blind spot. The door was shut. No scuff marks. No blood. No trail. But there were prints. Faint, small, uneven. Not boots. Not thick soles. Sneakers maybe. Narrow tread. The kind that would wear down quick if you spent too long on hard flooring. I pulled the bolt cutters from my sling and tapped the door handle. It didn't move. No lock resistance either, just frozen from moisture. Ortega reached past me and nudged it. It creaked once, then gave. The stairwell was pitch dark. I clicked on my filtered light, but I didn't enter. Not yet. I leaned forward, let the light crawl up the first flight of steps. Trash, a bootlace, cracked ceramic mug, more dust than I expected. No sound, no air movement. That alone made me nervous. I signaled them in. Cal went first, Ortega behind. I followed, keeping my steps to the left edge of each stair to avoid the warped middle treads. We reached the first landing. The window was bricked from the outside. No view. Just scratches on the inside pane. Not fresh, not old. Long vertical scores like someone had used a dull blade or piece of rebar. I didn't like it. We moved up one more flight. The hallway door at the next landing was open half an inch. just enough to let sound slip out. I held up a fist. Everyone stopped. From the gap came a low static hiss. Not white noise, not wind, radio feedback. Cal heard it too. He looked back at me, confused. I moved forward and tilted my head. Someone was running a shortwave on low volume, somewhere past that door. The signal shifted once, buzzed, then cut out. Silence followed. I should have pulled us out then. That was the moment. But we were already inside, already too deep. I pushed the door open slow and stepped into the hallway. The light above us flickered once, then went dead. The corridor was narrow, cluttered, lined with overturned filing cabinets and storage carts. On the floor near the center, a small transceiver sat half buried in a pile of documents. No antenna, no batteries in the compartment, just the shell. I stepped closer, scanned the walls. Scratch marks, not from fingernails, something harder. Metal on concrete. Someone had moved gear through here, heavy gear. Then I saw it. A small black cord strung tight across the hall, about waist high. I stopped mid-step. Cal didn't. He brushed past my shoulder and caught the trip line. It snapped with a faint ping. I shoved him back. The trap was quiet. No explosion, no noise. But a red light blinked to life in the far corner of the hallway, just above an air vent. One blink, then two, then a long pause. Ortega swore and ducked. I grabbed Cal and dragged him back toward the stairwell. We hit the first landing when the groaning started. Not human, not even close. Dozens of dry, grinding vocalizations, like a wall of sound rising from below the floor. We had triggered something. Not mechanical, biological. That light had been a signal to the infected. The first impact hit the lower stairwell door with force. The metal rang, then another, then a cracking noise. Not wood, bone. I pulled the flare from my pack, struck it, and tossed it down the stairwell shaft. The red glow lit up a mass of moving shapes at the bottom. Not shambling, climbing. I turned and yelled, "Up! Now! Get to the roof!" We ran. Ortega slipped once but caught the rail. Cal dropped his bag. I didn't stop. We hit the fourth floor landing and found the emergency ladder access already open. Someone had used this exit recently. Fresh scuff on the edge, rope abrasion. I climbed first, pushed the hatch, and pulled myself onto the roof. Ortega followed. Cal was slower. He was halfway up when the first infected reached the top of the stairwell. I looked down and saw one of them grab Cal's ankle. His scream was short. One pull, and he lost his grip. He fell backwards. The last thing I saw was his head striking the edge of the rail. Ortega hesitated. He wanted to go back down. I grabbed him by the collar and forced him through the hatch. We slammed it shut and rolled the broken vent fan across it. Not a perfect lock, but enough for now. The roof was flat and cracked. No exit ladders. No connected structures. We were boxed in. Ortega paced the edge, scanning the surrounding buildings. No planks, no walkways. Just a narrow drop to a second-story awning on the west side. Too far unless you were desperate. The infected were slamming the hatch from below. It wouldn't last. I tied my rope to a vent pipe, looped the rest into a harness, and tossed the end over the west side. It landed short. Ortega looked at me, unsure. I didn't have time to explain. "You go first," I told him. "Aim for the gutter. Roll right." As Ortega steadied his feet at the edge of the roof, hands gripping the knotted rope just before his descent, the shot cracked through the morning air like dry wood splitting against steel. The sound echoed off the walls of the alleyway, sharp and immediate. I didn't register it as a rifle shot until Ortega's legs buckled and his upper body swung sideways, pulling the rope taut. His grip failed. He didn't scream. He just dropped. I watched his body hit the awning like a sandbag, bounce once, then roll limp over the edge and down into the metal grate of the fire escape below. A second round came immediately after. It missed me by inches, chipped the concrete ledge beside my right foot, and sent fragments scattering across the rooftop like glass. I dropped back and scrambled to the center of the roof, scanning the opposite buildings. That shot hadn't come from below. It came from elevation, somewhere northeast, probably from one of the intact 3-story row houses we'd passed on the approach. That meant at least one shooter, maybe two, watching us the whole time, waiting for movement. The infected were still slamming the roof hatch. Their rhythm had changed, no longer random, more force behind it. The old metal was bending now. The bolt lock was already deformed from the pressure. It wasn't going to hold much longer. I crouched low, ducked behind a broken HVAC unit, and reached up to check my own shoulder. My jacket was torn high on the left side. When I slid my hand under the outer layer, it came back slick, warm. The entry was high, right through the meaty part between the collar and upper arm. I felt for bone. Nothing broken. The bullet had gone through clean, but the pain was already spreading. No time to wrap it. I yanked a gauze pad from my side pouch, shoved it into the wound, and secured it with 2 turns of cloth ripped from the inner seam of my jacket. It wasn't sterile. It wasn't smart. But I didn't have another option. I had maybe 2 minutes before that hatch gave out, and less than that if the shooter repositioned. I crawled to the western edge of the roof where the awning connected to the 2nd-story window ledge. I had dropped the rope already. Ortega's body had collapsed awkwardly across the fire escape platform, one arm hanging through the rail. I couldn't see blood from this angle, but his legs weren't moving. I didn't know if he was dead, but he was definitely out. I'd have to leave him behind. Another round hit the rooftop duct behind me and sent rusted fragments into the air. They weren't trying to wound me anymore. They wanted the kill. I yanked the rope, rewound it around my forearm, and set both boots against the ledge. With the rope too short, I'd have to drop the last 10 feet and roll the landing. Not ideal with a shot shoulder, but I'd done worse. The hatch behind me gave one final groan and cracked open. The bent corner curled upward, and the first infected hand emerged through the gap. Torn sleeve, skin blackened and pocked with dried blood. The fingers stretched wide, searching. I didn't wait. I jumped. The rope gave resistance for about 2 seconds before the knot slipped through the last ring. My boots hit the sloped edge of the awning. I angled my body sideways and let myself fall with gravity. The landing on the fire escape was ugly. My left knee slammed the metal rail. The impact knocked the air out of me. I rolled over Ortega's legs and smacked into the corner post with my back. My arm flared with fresh pain as the gauze slipped from the wound. No time to check him. I grabbed the lower ladder, kicked it loose, and let it swing down to the ground. As I started to descend, another shot rang out. This one struck the wall just to my left, sending chunks of brick flying across my face. I jumped the last 4 rungs and hit the alley floor hard enough to jar my spine. I turned north and ran. My boots slapped against cracked pavement as I cut through the alley behind the sushi bar, ducked under a hanging cable line, and turned into the hollow remains of a dried-out car wash. My legs were shaky, but the adrenaline was overriding the pain in my shoulder. Blood was still seeping, slower now, but I could feel the warmth pooling under the cloth. I didn't stop. I cleared the lot, hopped a low wall made of cinder blocks stacked without mortar, and crawled into the broken garage behind the laundromat. I paused behind an old dryer unit long enough to check my pack. No comms. I'd left the radio on Ortega. I had no way to call back to base. If they'd set a perimeter, they'd know I'd try to return to the west side. That meant I had to cut south and circle from behind the old parking structure. The sound of infected echoed faintly across the buildings behind me. Not close yet, but tracking. My blood trail would make it worse. I pulled off the gauze and slapped a tighter strip of cloth against the wound, tying it off with wire from my tool roll. It hurt like hell, but it held. I moved west through the collapsed stairwell beside the hardware outlet, using the shelves as partial cover. Every sound I made felt louder than it was. Rats skittered along the edge of a broken freezer. A rusted shopping cart tipped over near the wall and rolled slowly across the tile before stopping. Nothing followed. I kept moving. By the time I reached the edge of the trench line, The sky was already dulling into late afternoon grey. My internal clock told me I had less than 90 minutes until sunset. I couldn't risk being above ground much longer. I found a maintenance tunnel that ran below the collapsed intersection near Race Street and slid down through the gap in the storm grate. It smelled like copper, wet paper, and mold. The tunnel was barely wide enough to crouch. I kept my injured arm tight to my chest and moved low, scraping the walls with my shoulder. My boots left streaks in the slime on the floor. The echo behind me was faint but constant, dripping water, small movements, the subtle change in air pressure when something shifts direction. I took a breath and turned off my light. Let my eyes adjust. There was a small pinhole of daylight coming from the western grate. I aimed for it. If I could reach the drainage ditch near the warehouse perimeter, I could climb the fencing and signal with the light stick. One chance, no margin for mistakes. As I reached the end of the tunnel, a shape blocked the opening. At first I thought it was one of them, but it didn't move like the infected. It held still, crouched low, one hand on the wall, other on a rifle. It was a person. I froze. He hadn't seen me. The light behind him cast a full silhouette. No insignia, no visible armor. Civilian clothes, light boots, good stance. Looked trained. He was watching the alleyway that led to the backside of the perimeter. If I made a sound, I was dead. I backed away 3 steps, crouched, and reached into my pack for the flare. I had one left. I struck it once. It didn't catch. I struck again. The flare hissed, lit up the tunnel in red. The figure turned immediately, lifting his weapon, but the light was too close. It blinded him. I threw it hard toward his chest and ran the opposite direction. I heard the first shot hit the wall to my right. Concrete chipped my face. The second shot missed completely. I dove left into a runoff trench, hit the ground, rolled twice, and crawled under a pipe. No footsteps followed. No call. Whoever he was, he didn't pursue. I crawled another 50 feet, circled north, and emerged behind the fencing near the west side of the warehouse. I slammed my boot against the gate 3 times, then twice more. The lock unlatched from inside. Marcus opened the door with his sidearm raised. He looked behind me, then pulled me in without a word. "Where's Cal and Ortega?" he asked. "Gone," I said. "We walked into a trap. It wasn't just infected. Someone set that building up, waited for us to take the bait. Cal panicked and ran when the alarm tripped. He didn't make it past the stairs. Ortega took a round before he could get off the roof." I slumped against the inside wall and let the pain catch up. I was losing blood again. Someone shouted for Lena. Someone else dragged in the medkit. The rest of the room went silent. We hadn't just lost 2 people. We'd confirmed what we all suspected. There were others in the city. That much was now certain. Not just scavengers or isolated survivors trying to hold on. These were people working together, coordinated, waiting in high places, setting traps with radio signals and trip lines. We'd seen the chalk markers, the fresh tracks, the silent observer on the rooftop. Now Ortega was dead. Cal too. I was bleeding from a bullet wound, and we had confirmation that someone out there knew our routes. They weren't reacting. They were preparing. Lena pulled the makeshift bandage off my shoulder and cleaned the wound. It wasn't deep enough to need stitching, but it had torn through enough muscle to keep my left arm mostly useless for a while. She packed it with gauze, added pressure, and taped it tight. I didn't talk while she worked. I just stared at the concrete floor under my boots and thought about the shape in the tunnel, crouched with his hand on the wall, weapon ready, calm and waiting. That wasn't someone scrounging to survive. That was someone on a mission. Marcus helped me to the bench, and someone handed me a bottle of water. The rest of the crew stood off to the side, quiet. No one asked about the others. They already knew. I took 2 slow sips and forced myself to breathe through my nose. The adrenaline had burned off. Now came the part where everything caught up. My legs felt heavy, my vision narrowed, my chest felt like it had a brick in it. But I couldn't rest. Not yet. We gathered around the map board again. This time, there were no debates. No one had to be convinced. I described everything. Every step, every door, every hallway. The placement of the radio shell, the red blinking light, the angle of the shot, the figure in the tunnel, the rooftop hatch. I gave it all, even the parts that made me look slow or stupid. There was no room for ego anymore. Devin marked 3 new points of interest on the eastern sector. Jefferson was burned, not physically, but tactically. We couldn't trust it. The chalk code we didn't recognize meant someone else was updating that location regularly. The stairwell had been staged. The rooftop had no exit options. Even the fire escape had been predictable. That trap wasn't thrown together overnight. It had been waiting. We shifted our focus westward, toward the district past the abandoned courthouse and the water treatment substation. Less traffic there, more risk, but more obscurity. If we moved our patrols through that area, we might pick up traces of whoever these people were. But that wasn't the priority. First, we had to harden the warehouse. Over the next few hours, we rotated everyone through watch shifts. We added more tripwire cans to the rear alley, repositioned the signal reflectors on the roof, and rechecked the elevation angles from the nearby rooftops. Marcus ran line-of-sight tests from the top of the fire escape. We adjusted the barrel cover and filled sandbags with whatever debris we could lift. Old gravel, dry cement powder, brick chunks. It wasn't about looking strong. It was about buying time if someone came for us. By nightfall, we had reworked the interior layout of the main floor. Barricades were pulled back from the windows and replaced with mobile shelving units that could be moved quickly. Emergency exits were cleared. We even ran chalk lines on the floor, marking fallback positions in case of breach. Everything felt colder and sharper. The warehouse wasn't a shelter now. It was a position. Nobody asked me to lead that work. I wasn't in charge. But no one stopped me either. After a run like that, people wanted to see someone keep moving. So I did. Around midnight, Devin asked if I could still write. I nodded and grabbed the salvage logbook. It was just a bound stack of yellow paper someone had pulled from a tax office back in the first few months. We recorded every run, every loss, every major threat. I flipped to the next empty page, took a deep breath, and began writing. Supply run designated JE2, departed base with Cal Turner and Ignacio Ortega at 8:12. Objective: recon of secondary stairwell and hallways in Jefferson sub-basement. Primary goal: confirm unknown chalk symbols and assess interior for further scavenging operations. Encountered signs of baiting. Recovered damaged radio shell used as visual lure. Tripped signal. Unknown observers engaged from elevation. Ortega shot and fell during rooftop escape. Cal killed during stairwell breach by infected. Lead runner wounded. Escaped via west fire escape and runoff trench. No salvage recovered. Mission failed. Status: hostile human presence confirmed. Base compromised by tracking risk. I set the pen down. My hand was shaking. Not from the wound, from the weight of it. The rest of the night moved slow. Nobody slept well. I lay on my side on the second floor grate, staring out the narrow upper window, watching the skyline for movement. A few times, I thought I saw figures in the distance, blurs between buildings, shapes that didn't move like infected, but I couldn't be sure. The city was still too dark. By morning, it was clear we had a new reality. The infected were still a threat, but they weren't the only one. The silence we'd been living under was gone. The illusion that we were alone was gone. The city wasn't empty. It was full of watchers. People who waited until the noise covered their footsteps. People who didn't call out or warn or negotiate. People who aimed to kill and vanished afterward. We didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but we knew they could move quietly, plan in advance, and shoot with precision, and they knew where we were. I rotated off watch just after noon. The warehouse was quiet, sealed up tight. Devin had reinforced the outer doors with a second layer of bracing. Lena had tripled the guard schedule. No one would be walking perimeter alone anymore. I sat at the edge of my cot and pulled the sling tighter around my shoulder. It throbbed every time I breathed too deep, I didn't complain. I didn't talk. I just stared at the map on the wall and thought about how it had changed. Not just the markings, the idea of it. That map used to represent possibilities, places we hadn't explored yet, supplies we could recover, rooms we could search. Now it was a list of places that could get us killed. Cal and Ortega had been names on that map just a day ago. Now they were gone. No bodies, no burial, just notes in the logbook and fading memories. That's what we became in the end. Not stories, not heroes, just marks on paper and habits someone else had to take over. I still had my pack, still had my knife, my cutters, my tape, my gauze. I could still move, still climb, still run if I had to. But I didn't want to run anymore. I wanted to make this place hold. I wanted to make the watchers afraid to come any closer. I didn't know how yet, but I would. Devin passed me a folded sheet of paper before nightfall. Someone had pinned it to the fence line near the west alley. No footsteps around it, no note. Just a page torn from a maintenance logbook, with a date scrawled in the center. 2 days from now. No time, no coordinates. Just a location, Fletcher and 9th. We stared at it for a long time. Was it a warning? A threat? A challenge? We didn't know yet, but we would go. We had to. We weren't the last survivors. We weren't alone. We weren't invisible, but we were still standing. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep the stories alive. For now, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and stay alive. Jack's Nightmares, signing off. Until next time, survivor.